11 years. Hundreds of birthdays, holidays, first days of school. And in almost every single photo, he isn't there. He built a life behind the lens. But somewhere in this house, there's a box he's never been ready to open. His children found it by accident. What was inside would finally answer the question they'd been afraid to ask. For 11 years, he recorded the truth he couldn't say out loud. Tonight, his children are finally watching it. After 11 years behind the camera, he finally stepped into the picture. This time, he wasn't missing.
If you look through 11 years of family photographs in the Reyes household, you will find birthday cakes, Christmas mornings, first days of school, a wobbly bicycle with training wheels, a soccer trophy held high, and in almost none of them, you will find David Reyes. He is the shadow at the edge of the frame, the blurred arm reaching back into the picture, the reflection caught by accident in a window. If you are the kind of person who has ever wondered why the person who loves you the most is so often missing from the pictures, stay with this story until the end. Because what David's children found in a locked box in the attic will change the way you think about every photograph your own parents never appeared in. And if this story moves you even a little, do something small for a man who has spent his whole life behind the lens. Hit like and subscribe, because stories like David's deserve to be seen, even if he never let himself be. 11-year-old Emily Reyes noticed it first, the way children notice things that adults have trained themselves not to see. It was a Tuesday evening in early October, and her fifth-grade teacher, Mrs. Alvarado, had assigned a project called Our Family Story, which required every student to bring in 5 photographs that represented their family and present them to the class. Emily sat cross-legged on the living room floor with the big cardboard box of photo albums that her father kept on the bottom shelf of the bookcase, flipping through years of birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday afternoons, looking for pictures of her dad. She found her 7th birthday, the one with the dinosaur cake. Her mother's handwriting was on the back, though her mother had not lived with them in 4 years. She found Jack's first day of kindergarten, his shoes untied, his backpack twice the size of his body. She found herself at 8, missing her front teeth, laughing so hard her eyes were closed. But in picture after picture, album after album, her father was nowhere. Not once. Not in a single frame. Jack, she called to her little brother, who was 7 and building something enormous and unstable out of couch cushions in the next room. Come look at this. Jack wandered over, dragging a stuffed dinosaur by one leg, and together the two. Children spread every photograph they could find across the living room carpet. Nearly 200 pictures, spanning a decade of birthdays, first days, holidays, sunburned summer afternoons at the lake, a hospital room the day Jack was born. Their father was in exactly 3 of them, and in each of those 3, he was a shoulder, a knee, half a face turned away, an out-of-focus figure rushing toward the edge of the shot. He's never in them, Emily said slowly, and something in her voice made it sound less like an observation and more like an accusation, though she did not yet know who or what she was accusing. Dad takes every single picture of us, but there's no pictures of him. Down the hall, in the small home office that had once been meant as a nursery for a 3rd child who never came, David Reyes sat at his desk editing photographs for a client's wedding, a pair of reading glasses pushed low on his nose, 3 cameras and a half-dozen lenses arranged with obsessive care on the shelf behind him. He was 39 years old, with warm tan skin weathered by years of outdoor shoots, short black hair beginning to silver at the temples, a few days of stubble he never quite found time to shave, and the kind of tired, gentle brown eyes that made strangers trust him instantly with their weddings, their newborns, their family reunions. He wore, as he almost always did, a faded blue denim jacket over a heather gray t-shirt, sleeves pushed up past his forearms, because he had learned long ago that comfortable clothes mattered when you spent 12 hours a day crouched behind a viewfinder. He heard his children's voices rise and fall in the living room, and assumed, as he usually did, that it was some small squabble over a toy. He had no idea that they had just discovered the central, aching truth of his entire adult life. To understand why David Reyes had disappeared from his own family's history, you would have to go back 13 years, to a small storefront studio on Maple Street, with a hand-painted sign that read Reyes and Mercer Photography. David had opened it with his younger brother Daniel, the two of them pooling every dollar they had, sleeping on air mattresses in the back room the first winter because they could not yet afford rent on an apartment. David was the eye, the one who understood light and composition, and the exact half-second when a genuine smile becomes a photograph worth keeping. Daniel was supposed to be the business mind, the one who handled contracts and client accounts and the studio's growing bank balance. For 6 years, it worked. The studio thrived. David married Claire, a school teacher with a laugh that filled a room, and they had Emily and then Jack, and for a while David Reyes believed he had built the life he was meant to have. Then came the expansion. Daniel proposed opening a second location downtown, promising it would triple their client base within 2 years, and David, trusting his brother the way only an older sibling can trust the person he taught to ride a bicycle, signed whatever papers Daniel put in front of him. What David did not know, could not have imagined, was that Daniel had been quietly diverting client deposits and studio funds into a separate account for over a year, using the expansion as cover, gambling the money away on investments that collapsed one after another. When the second location's landlord filed a lawsuit for unpaid rent, and the bank called in the studio's loans, it was David's name on every document, David's signature on every contract, because Daniel had made certain of that from the very beginning. Daniel disappeared 3 weeks before the truth came out, taking what remained of the money with him, leaving David to face auditors, furious clients who had paid deposits for weddings that never happened, and a mountain of debt with his name attached to every dollar of it. Claire believed in David through the bankruptcy hearings, through the humiliating newspaper article that named Reyes and Mercer Photography without ever printing Daniel's part of the story clearly enough, through the sale of their house to cover what the business could not. But belief has a breaking point, and grief has a way of curdling into blame when there is no one else left standing close enough to blame. Claire had married a rising photographer with his own studio. She found herself, 4 years later, married to a man working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, a man who flinched every time the phone rang because it might be another creditor, a man so consumed by guilt and shame that he stopped talking about anything that mattered. She did not leave because she stopped loving him. She left, she told him in their last real conversation, because she could not watch him disappear one more year, and because she needed, for her own sake and for the children's, to build a life that was not standing permanently in the wreckage of someone else's betrayal. She moved 2 states away to live near her sister. David did not fight the divorce. He did not fight for full custody either, at first believing, wrongly, painfully, that his children were better off with the parent who had not brought ruin into the house. It took a family court judge and 18 months of supervised weekends for David to understand that his children needed their father far more than they needed him to punish himself. By the time Emily was 5 and Jack was 1, David had full custody. A small rented house 2 towns over from the one they had lost. A job stocking shelves at Hargrove's Hardware from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. And every evening and weekend booked with freelance photography jobs, other people's weddings, other people's newborns, other people's school portraits, because it was the only skill he had left that could still put food on the table. And here is the quiet, terrible irony that neither of his children understood until they were old enough to piece it together. David Reyes became, without ever choosing it, the photographer at every single one of his own children's milestones, because he was the only photographer they could afford, and because the moment he lifted a camera to his eye, it was the one place in the world where he still felt competent, still felt like a man worth something, still felt like he was giving his children something beautiful instead of a life built out of someone else's wreckage. So on Emily's 6th birthday, when the extended family gathered in the small backyard, David was the one crouched by the cake table catching the exact moment she blew out her candles, and there was no one left to catch him standing beside her. On Jack's first day of kindergarten, David walked him to the bus stop with the good camera slung around his neck because a neighbor with a nicer camera had once told him his photos were the best anyone in the neighborhood had ever seen of their own kids, and it had lit something in him he desperately needed lit. At Emily's dance recitals, he was in the wings with a zoom lens instead of in the audience with a phone like every other parent. At Jack's Little League games, he was crouched behind home plate getting the shot instead of standing at the fence cheering with his hands free. Every single time, David told himself the same thing. Someone has to remember this properly. Someone has to make sure these moments don't just disappear the way everything else did. He never once let himself finish the second half of that thought, which was that he had quietly decided somewhere in the wreckage of the studio and the marriage that he was the one who was supposed to disappear. Around town, people began to know David Reyes as simply the camera guy. The quiet, reliable man who showed up early to every school fundraiser, every church picnic, every Little League opening day, camera bag already slung over his shoulder before anyone had even asked him to bring it. Parents trusted him instantly, the way people trust someone who clearly loves what he does and asks for very little in return. What none of them ever thought to ask in all those years was who was taking pictures of David's own family, or why the man capturing everyone else's happiest memories seemed to slip out of frame the moment anyone turned a lens toward him. It became a kind of open secret that was never quite spoken aloud, a small-town curiosity people noticed and let go of, the way you notice a house on your street with the curtains always drawn and decide eventually that it is simply none of your business. David preferred it that way. As long as no one asked, he never had to explain the part of the story that still felt, even after a decade, too heavy to say out loud in daylight. Back in the present, in the living room now littered with photographs, Emily marched down the hallway and pushed open the office door without knocking, Jack close behind her, clutching a photograph of David's blurred elbow at the edge of a birthday party. "Dad," Emily said, holding up a fistful of pictures like evidence in a trial, "why aren't you in any of our pictures, ever?" David turned from his monitor, and for a moment something in his face went very still, the particular stillness of a man who has spent 11 years hoping a question would never be asked, and has never once prepared an answer for it. "Somebody has to take the pictures, Bug," he said finally, reaching for the old easy joke, the one that had always worked before. But Emily was 11 now, not 6, and the joke did not land the way it once had. "That's not an answer," she said, and her voice cracked slightly, not with anger, but with something closer to hurt. "Mrs. Alvarado wants pictures of our family for the project, and I don't have one single normal picture of you. Not one. I don't even know what you look like laughing. I only know what you look like behind a camera." David did not have an answer for that. Not one he was ready to give an 11-year-old and a 7-year-old on a Tuesday night with wedding photos still open on his monitor. He told them he needed to think about it, kissed them both goodnight, and sat alone in his office long after they had gone to bed, staring at a blank document he had opened and closed a dozen times, trying and failing to write down, even just for himself, why he had spent a decade making sure his children would have a beautiful visual record of a childhood he was not visibly part of. He did not sleep well that night. He kept thinking about a locked fireproof box in the attic that he had not opened in almost 3 years, and about the promise he had made to himself the day he bought it, a promise he had never told a living soul about. 2 weeks later, on a rainy Saturday when David had left for an all-day wedding shoot 2 hours away, Emily and Jack were supposed to be at their grandmother's house, but a mix-up in scheduling left them home alone with their teenage neighbor, Maribel, watching them for the afternoon. Restless and still turning over the unanswered question from 2 weeks earlier, Emily climbed into the attic looking for old Halloween costumes and instead found, tucked behind a stack of moving boxes from the old house, a gray fireproof lockbox with a small brass key taped to its underside, the kind of hiding spot an adult uses when he wants something to be findable eventually, just not too soon. Inside was an external hard drive labeled in David's neat handwriting, for Emily and Jack, when they're ready. Beneath it were 341 printed photographs, each one a photograph of David himself, alone or with the children just out of frame, time-stamped and dated across 11 years, each with a small handwritten note on the back. Maribel, 16 and unsure whether this was her business to interfere with, helped Emily plug the hard drive into the family computer. What loaded was a folder of video files, one for each of the children's birthdays going back to the year of the divorce, each between 3 and 11 minutes long, each recorded late at night in this same small office. David speaking directly into the camera, the way a man speaks when he believes or fears that this might be the only way his children ever truly hear him. The first video, recorded the year Emily turned 6, showed a much thinner, more hollow-eyed version of their father, sitting in almost total darkness except for the glow of a desk lamp. "Hey, Bug," he said to the camera, his voice unsteady. "You turned 6 today, and I took about 400 pictures of you blowing out your candles. And I bet when you're older and you look back at them, you're going to wonder where your old man was standing. So I'm making this so that someday, when you're ready, you'll know. I wasn't standing anywhere. I was right there the whole time on the other side of the lens, loving you so much it was hard to breathe. I just didn't know how to be in the picture and hold everything together at the same time. Maybe that's a thing I need to fix. But I didn't want you growing up thinking I wasn't there. I was always there. I promise you that. Video after video told the same story in different words, across different years, David's face slowly changing, the hollow exhaustion of the early years gradually softening into something steadier, calmer, more at peace, though never entirely free of the ache underneath it. In the fourth video, recorded the year Jack turned 4, David finally said the thing he had never said to his children directly. There is something I never told you two about why things fell apart with the studio and with your mom, and I think when you're older you deserve the truth instead of guessing at it. My brother, your Uncle Daniel, who you've never met, he stole from our business. He stole a lot, and he let me take the blame for it. And I let your mom marry a man who lost basically everything because I trusted the wrong person with something I built. Your mom didn't leave because she stopped loving you, or even because she stopped loving me. She left because watching me disappear into guilt for years was its own kind of grief, and she needed air. None of that is a secret I want you carrying around feeling bad about. It's just the truth, and you deserve it eventually. In the most recent video recorded only 4 months earlier on Jack's 7th birthday, David said something that made both children, sitting side by side in front of the computer screen, start to cry without quite understanding why. I keep thinking maybe one day I'll let myself be in a picture again. I keep thinking maybe I've paid enough. I don't know when that day is. But if you're watching this and you're old enough to be asking questions about why your dad's never in any photos, that means the day might finally be now. That evening, when David came home rain-soaked and exhausted from the wedding shoot, he found his children waiting for him at the kitchen table, the fireproof box open between them, both of their faces red and swollen from crying, and he understood immediately, with the particular dread of a man whose most carefully guarded secret has finally been found, exactly what had happened. He did not get angry. He sat down slowly across from them, and for a long moment none of them said anything at all. It was Jack, 7 years old and utterly without guile, who finally broke the silence. "Is Uncle Daniel a real person?" he asked. "Do we have an uncle?" And David, who had rehearsed 100 different versions of this conversation in his head for over a decade, and had never once believed he would actually have to have it, found that the truth, once it finally started coming out, came out easier than he had ever expected. He told them everything, plainly and without flinching, about the studio, about Daniel, about the bankruptcy and the newspaper article and the slow unraveling of his marriage to their mother, who he was careful even now to defend rather than blame. Your mom is a good person, who went through something hard because of a mistake that wasn't hers or mine. Not really. It was your uncle's mistake, and I let it cost more people than it should have, he said. Emily asked the question that had been sitting in her chest for 2 weeks. Is that why you're never in any of the pictures? Because of what Uncle Daniel did? David thought about it for a long moment before answering honestly. Not exactly, he said. After everything fell apart, taking pictures was the one thing I still knew how to do right. And I think somewhere along the way I decided that if I could just keep being the person who gave you two something beautiful to remember, it didn't matter if I was in it. I think I decided I didn't deserve to be in it. That wasn't fair to either of you, and it wasn't fair to me either, and I'm sorry it took you finding that box for me to finally say that out loud. What none of them knew that rainy evening was that Daniel Reyes was, at that very moment, 300 miles away, sitting in his car outside a modest apartment complex, working up the courage to knock on a door for the first time in 11 years. Daniel had spent the last decade building and losing 2 more businesses, burning through the very money he had stolen, and had recently completed a court-mandated financial counseling program after a much smaller, much less damaging fraud conviction in another state. A conviction that had nothing to do with David, but that had cracked something open in him, forced him to finally sit with the scale of what he had done to his own brother. He had found David's address through a mutual cousin, and had been sitting outside that apartment complex for 40 minutes, terrified when his phone buzzed with a text from that same cousin. He doesn't live there anymore. Moved across town 2 years ago. Here's the new address. But Daniel, think hard before you do this. He might not want to see you. He has every right not to. Daniel showed up at David's door 6 days later on a Sunday afternoon, unannounced. And the moment David opened the door and saw his brother's face for the first time in 11 years, older, grayer, thinner, unmistakably ashamed, Every carefully buried feeling he had spent a decade compartmentalizing rose up at once. There was a version of this moment David had imagined 1,000 times in the dark, angry years right after the bankruptcy, slamming the door, calling the police, finally saying every furious thing he had never gotten the chance to say when Daniel vanished. He had earned the right to that version of the moment, and for one long, suspended second, standing in his own doorway with his children's laughter drifting from the living room behind him, he considered it. Instead, David stepped outside onto the porch, pulled the door shut behind him so the children would not hear, and asked his brother in a voice flatter and calmer than he expected to be able to manage exactly one question: why now, after everything? Daniel's answer was not a good excuse, and he did not try to make it one. He told David about the second conviction, about finally being forced by a judge and a counselor to write out, in exhausting detail, every person he had harmed and how writing David's name at the top of that list, alongside Claire's and, indirectly, Emily's and Jack's, had been the first time in over a decade he had let himself actually feel the size of it instead of running from it. He did not ask for money. He did not ask to be forgiven on the spot. He asked, quietly, if there was ever a version of the future where his brother might let him earn back even a small piece of trust, starting with nothing more than honesty. And he told David that if the answer was no, if David wanted him to leave and never come back, he would respect that completely because he had already taken more than his share of chances. David did not forgive his brother that afternoon, and this story will not pretend that healing works that quickly or that neatly. What David did was harder and slower and more honest than instant forgiveness. He told Daniel he was not ready to let him near his children. That trust was not something that came back just because Daniel had finally said sorry after 11 years, but that he was willing, for the first time, to have one supervised conversation a month at a coffee shop with no promises attached, to see whether 11 years of damage could be repaired one careful, unhurried inch at a time. It was not revenge, and it was not instant reconciliation. It was something rarer and more difficult than either. The deliberate, unglamorous work of a man choosing not to let his brother's worst decision define the rest of both their lives, without pretending that decision had not cost him almost everything. The weeks that followed changed something quiet and fundamental in the Reyes household. Emily started asking to look through the fireproof box's photographs on purpose now. No longer secretly, learning her father's face year by year. The exhausted 29-year-old in the first photo, the steadier 36-year-old further along, the calmer, more present man he was slowly becoming now. Jack began asking David to teach him how to use the camera, standing on a step stool to reach the tripod, insisting on being the one to count down before pressing the shutter. And one evening in late November, 3 weeks before Emily's 12th birthday, the two children spent an entire Saturday afternoon quietly plotting with their grandmother and with Maribel, setting up the good camera on a tripod in the backyard, stringing up string lights between the fence posts. And when David came home from a shoot expecting to grab a quick dinner before editing photos late into the night, he found his children and his mother standing in the golden light of early evening, the camera already framed and ready, the timer already set. "We want a real one this time," Emily said, taking her father's hand and pulling him gently toward the center of the frame. "With you in it, not your elbow." Jack grabbed his other hand, grinning his gap-toothed grin. And David Reyes, professional photographer, single father, a man who had spent 11 years believing he belonged only on the other side of the lens, let himself be led, laughing despite himself, into the center of his own family's photograph for the first time since before the studio collapsed, since before the divorce, since before he decided, quietly and without ever saying it out loud, that showing up mattered more than being seen. The timer counted down. The shutter clicked. And for the first time in over a decade, there existed a photograph of David Reyes not reaching toward the frame, not rushing out of it, not caught in blur at its furthest edge, but standing squarely in the middle of it, one arm around each of his children, laughing, present, and completely, finally, in the picture. That photograph now hangs framed above the fireplace in the Reyes house. The first of many that followed, a father learning one imperfect year at a time that love is not diminished by being visible, and that the people who spend their lives making sure everyone else is remembered deserve, eventually, to be remembered too. If there is a person like David in your own life, a parent, a grandparent, anyone who has spent years standing just outside the frame so that everyone else could be seen, Maybe this is the week you ask them to step into the picture. And if this story reached something in you, don't let it end here. Subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and let David Reyes remind you that sometimes the person taking every photograph is the one who most deserves to finally be in one.